This video was brought to you by Ground News. On Wednesday evening at about 6:10 p.m, an Embraer Legacy jet with tail number RA02795 flying from Moscow to St. Petersburg crashed in the Russian region of Tver, just north of Moscow. According to Russian state media, all 10 people on board, including 3 crew members and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the infamous Wagner group, died in the crash. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what happened yesterday, what Prigozhin's death tells us about Putin's regime, and how this might affect both the war in Ukraine and Wagner's presence in Africa. So let's just start with a brief overview of the past 24 hours. Before we get on to Prigozhin's death, something else significant happened in Russia yesterday. In the morning, General Sergei Surovikin was relieved of his command of the Russian aerospace forces. Surovikin, sometimes nicknamed General Armageddon, was appointed head of Russia's invasion force last October, after a series of embarrassing battlefield setbacks in Ukraine, including the Russian army's retreat in Kharkiv. While the Russian army has undeniably fared better under his command than under that of his predecessors, largely thanks to the fact that they've started more aggressively targeting Ukrainian infrastructure, he was relatively close to the Wagner group and Prigozhin. After Wagner's attempted coup a couple of months ago, he essentially disappeared, and the Kremlin refused to provide any information on his whereabouts, apart from claiming he was, quote, resting. Anyway, in retrospect, it looks like he was put under house arrest, and the Kremlin have apparently now decided to get rid of him. This was obviously pretty big news in its own right, and in a way it bodes well for Ukraine. After all, Surovikin was arguably Russia's most competent senior commander in Ukraine, and it's now unclear what role he's going to play in the war. However, a few hours later, something even more newsworthy happened. Yevgeny Prigozhin's jet crashed just north of Moscow. On board was not just Prigozhin, but also Dmitry Utkin, Wagner's original founder. For context, Utkin was a neo-Nazi who served with the GRU, a branch of the Russian intelligence services, until 2013, when he dropped out and founded the Wagner group with Prigozhin. In response to the news, a crucifix was lit up on the Wagner headquarters in St. Petersburg. Reports from Wagner-aligned Telegram channels suggest that Prigozhin had only recently flown back from Africa, where much of the Wagner group is currently deployed. Prigozhin released a video from Africa only a few days ago, and while it seemed he was shifting the focus of his operations to Africa, he released a telephone number in his last message which showed that new recruitment for Wagner in Russia was ongoing. So, assuming that this wasn't an unfortunate accident, what actually just happened here? Well, obviously the consensus is that Prigozhin was just assassinated by Putin, but there are 2 other semi-conspiracies currently doing the rounds on Russian Telegram channels. The first is that this has all been staged by Prigozhin and Putin, and that he didn't really die. There have been some reports that, roughly half an hour after the first plane crashed, another plane owned by Prigozhin took off in the other direction, i.e. from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and landed safely. There have also been rumours on more obscure Russian Telegram channels that Prigozhin was assassinated not by Putin, but rather by the GRU, apparently because he was resisting GRU plans to replace Wagner in Africa. Nonetheless, the most likely explanation does seem to be that Prigozhin was assassinated by Putin. For starters, the idea that Prigozhin is somehow still alive seems deeply implausible. Russian state media claims that it's identified Prigozhin's and Utkin's bodies from the wreckage, and if he was alive, you'd expect someone as boisterous as Prigozhin to release a video on Telegram or something. Similarly, Putin has an obvious incentive to get rid of Prigozhin after the attempted coup earlier this year, and while it might seem a bit belated, Putin has form in this respect. Alexander Litvinenko and Anna Politkovskaya, for example, criticised the Chechen war in the early 2000s, but were only assassinated years later, in 2006. There's also strong evidence that the plane was actually shot down, and it didn't just crash, Witnesses and the Wagner-aligned Grey Zone channel reported that the crash was preceded by 2 bangs, presumably from anti-air systems, and that there were separate vapour trails, presumably from the anti-air missiles. In the video of the crash that's doing the rounds on social media at the moment, you can see the plane suddenly fall out the sky with what looks like smoke coming out of it, which suggests it was hit mid-air rather than just crashing. So, assuming that Putin did just assassinate Prigozhin, which seems to be the consensus at the moment, what happens next? Well, from Putin's perspective, this is a risky move. Wagner-affiliated Telegram channels have already made their displeasure clear, and Belarusian media reported that Wagner troops in Belarus were trying to travel to Russia, presumably to stage another mutiny against the Kremlin. So far, however, it looks like Putin is safe. The Belarusian authorities cut off internet in the area of the main Wagner Group camp in the Tail village in Belarus, and we're yet to see a substantial response from Wagner. Pro-Kremlin sources have already announced that the Russian army plans to fold the remaining Wagner troops in Belarus into the Russian army. If Putin can contain these immediate risks, then it's probably good for him personally. After all, getting rid of Prigozhin and making it clear to other elites that trying to overthrow his regime will get you killed should shore up his weakened authority. However, it's probably not good news for the Russian army in Ukraine. There'll be basically no trust between Russian elites at the moment, which means that Putin will have to rely on his cronies, including people like Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, to prosecute the war in Ukraine. But if recent history has demonstrated anything, it's that Putin's inner circle aren't very good at actually fighting wars, which is why he had to get Wagner involved in the first place. It's also probably not good news for Russia's relationship with Africa. Russia has been able to develop close relationships with certain African countries via the Wagner Group, which has acted as a security guarantor. With Utkin and Prigozhin dead, it's hard to see how Wagner continues its operations in Africa, and this isn't going to go down well with countries who rely on Wagner for their security. Take Mali, for example, which replaced the French with Wagner a year or so ago. They're currently fighting on 3 fronts: against an Al-Qaeda offshoot that's currently sieging Timbuktu, against ISIS fighters that are destabilizing the entire Sahel, and now against Arab and Tuareg separatists in the north. Without Wagner, it's hard to see the Malayan state keeping things together, and this could have knock-on consequences for the Sahel region's wider security. If you want to know what's happening next though, the best way is with Ground News. A website and app designed to help you take the power of the media into your own hands. Here's how it works. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. They then organise these articles by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lean on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. For example, take this story about a Russian pilot defecting to Russia. Ground shows us that 41 outlets are reporting on it, with us able to examine their bias and find that 47% of those lean left, while just 26% lean right. You can then swipe through some of the headlines comparing how different outlets cover it. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. Now, our team at TLDR likes Ground News so much that we decided to offer a 30% discount on the Ground News Vantage plan to all our viewers. And that includes access to a feature called My News Bias, which is basically a dashboard for your news diet. Sign up to find out how your reading habits change over the next week. What are your top sources? Are you engaging with diverse perspectives? What about your favourite topics? Find out with Ground News Vantage, which is 30% off only using our link. So make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.